Hi, Internet. It's Emily SW.
Sam.
And we are here with the Podcastle. I don't know the number because I never know the number. Is it 20?
We kind of stopped counting.
Yeah. Well, we did a double batch last time, and we're kind of all over the...
Yes, last time was 17.
Okay.
On the subject of the double batch, though, you would think because we had just posed the question, we would remember to then answer the question, but we completely forgot to answer our question from the crystal egg episode.
Was that, how do you like your eggs? No.
No, that was from Night to the Circus. It was what would be in a store window that would get you to go inside.
Ah, yes. Do you want to go first, or shall I?
If we're sticking with the antique store, my answer would be World War II women's Marine Corps stuff.
That's a good one. I don't collect that stuff. I don't do any of that kind of thing. But because I know you and because you tell me about that, when I go into an antique store, I keep an eye out for it. And if there's anything that looks interesting, that I'm like, hey, is this something you need?
Well, it's kind of hard to find for a couple reasons. The first being there were by far less women in the Marine Corps than there were men. It's just by numbers, there's less of it. And also, because it was, at least the uniform pieces were good stuff, people used them beyond the war, so they continued to wear the shoes, they used the bags, they converted their uniforms into day suits.
Yeah, that's understandable. Well, plus, I'm sure there's a lot of people who keep that stuff in the family, too. It doesn't end up in the antique store to begin with.
Right.
What would my answer be? Honestly, I just like an antique store. I will say, though, lately, the thing that I always keep an eye out for is interesting dishware, cookware kind of thing for my, things for my altar, because I am a pagan person. So I'm always kind of on the lookout for something that might be useful, or like bells. I'm big on bells. Sound cleansing, because I have a cat and an asthmatic wife. So smoke cleansing is not always feasible.
Makes sense.
Yeah. So, and I did the one time at an antique store, I found a mini little cauldron, little cast iron cauldron. It was perfect. It's fun. But I mean, honestly, it could be nothing. It could just be a sketchy store, blacked out windows. It just says antiques. I would go in it.
That's probably the best one, though.
There's two options. Either it's going to be the best one with the best stuff, or you're going to end up in some sort of novel. Whether it's a horror novel, a science fiction novel, a fantasy novel, don't know.
My thought with that is because you would never actually really see uniforms in a window because they would be subject to sun damage. So the blacked out curtains is a good idea.
Yeah, that's true. Plus, I mean, antiques generally, books can get pretty much anything can be sun damaged. Some of my BTS albums are sun damaged. No eggs, no crystal egg. If I saw a crystal egg, that would not tempt me any more or less than I already was.
Well, now that you've read The Crystal Egg, maybe your opinion will change.
It's true. You know what? It might tempt me to go in there and pick it up and just to see if I could see Mars.
That's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
You might just have to go and at least take a look.
Even just for the lulz at this point, just for the meme. Dude, for the gram.
So now that we're caught up, we should answer the question from the last episode, which was Something Wicked This Way Comes. And the question was, have you ever played a carnival game and or won any prizes from a carnival game?
Yeah, so my answer to that question is, have I played carnival games? Yes. Have I won anything? No. My sister won a goldfish once, and that fish was the best fish. He lived forever. He lived for like 3 or 4 years, and he was very friendly. He would come up and blow bubbles at you anytime you entered the room.
That's cute.
Yeah, great fish. 10 out of 10. I miss him. I don't remember his name, but he was a great fish.
When you take care of them, they will live quite a while. I've seen people with their carnival fish in those little, those plastic containers you're supposed to catch bugs in.
Yeah.
And the fish was just going back and forth, and I was like, this fish is insane. It has lost its mind. I felt so bad for it because there was, first of all, this tiny little container. There was nothing in the container, no plants, no decoration, nothing. And it stressed me out watching this fish.
Yeah, I think what you're describing there is called purgatory.
If you're not prepared to get a proper tank with, plants and places for your fish to hide, do not get the fish.
Do research too, because I hate going into Petco or PetSmart, and you see the betas in those tiny little cups, and it makes me so sad.
So it's like a mixed thing. Do you buy the fish and continue the business? Or do you buy the fish because you know you can provide a home for it and take it away from this situation that it's already in and you can't undo the fish's life any other way?
Yeah, I often feel that way. And, previously, because I recently moved and we had no place to put a fish or anything like that, but now I'm in a different space. And after we get unpacked, I'm thinking I might have to go on a rescue mission.
In order to save those fish, you do have to encourage that business.
There is no moral or ethical way to participate in capitalism. That's the moral of that story. But anyways, PSA for this episode, folks. If you have a fish, or if you're planning on getting a fish, you think you might want a fish, get a big enough tank, do your research. Even one fish, even one tiny betta fish, needs more room than you think. I mean, the same goes for any animal. But anyways,
I have not personally played a carnival game aside from maybe doing one of the ring tosses that like someone else was already doing. You have the rings and you're supposed to toss them on the ducks or throw the balls in the little cup.
Yeah, I've played, I think my sister won the fish in like a fishing game where you fish out a duck that has a number on it or like a color code, and that corresponds to the kind of prize you get.
I do have what I think were prizes, stuffed animals and plushies that were probably from a carnival or a fair. The most notable being that zombie teddy bear that I have.
Yeah. I've definitely won those cheap little things, but the one that always sticks out in my mind, and I don't know what game I played to get it, but I got one of those inflatable guitars, and I just loved that thing until, inevitably it popped because it was a cheap piece of garbage.
Right. So this bear, he's a good size.
Yeah, I've seen that bear. It doesn't, it looks nicer than most cheap carnival games.
Perfect huggable size, but he's full of what feels like styrofoam.
Yeah.
His stuffing is clearly not good, and he's got stitches over his mouth, and he's got one eye, and the one eye is stitched over. I did not get him from a carnival. I actually got him from the latchkey program that I worked at in high school. They were having a yard sale, so all the parents could, donate stuff that would be sold at the daycare. And someone had donated this bear, and I said to the director, if that bear is still there at the end of the day, can I have it? And she said, just go take it. So I just went outside and I grabbed this bear. I'm sure she was convinced no one else would want it. She was probably right.
Yeah, you need to be a particular brand of person to gravitate towards that. And we are that kind of person.
So I took the bear. He's in my bedroom to this day.
Yeah, have you ever considered doing like bear surgery and replacing his insides with something a little more squishy?
No, because I kind of like that he's a little firm, because then you can really hug him.
I feel that. Should we move on to the actual topic of this episode?
All right, yeah, let's get into this story.
We are going to read The Birthmark by Nathaniel Hawthorne.
This is the first time I've read Hawthorne, but I didn't actually read it. I listened to, well, I guess it's not really an audiobook, but I listened to someone reading it on YouTube.
Mm-hmm.
And the way I chose this video, because I figured there would probably be a couple of people narrating it. And there were at least 3 that came up right away at the top of the list. And I just picked one based on which voice I thought was the most pleasing to my ear.
Yeah.
But then it got to be about 37 minutes into it, and the narrator suddenly started having a coughing fit. And I thought, wow, if she doesn't come back and say sorry about that for not cutting that out. But she didn't do that. The video just stopped, and the story wasn't even over with yet.
What
I was sitting in the chair, curled up with the cat, and I had my eyes closed, so I was really confused.
Yeah, that doesn't make any sense to me. But so you were 7 minutes from the end. So what part did you end off at then?
Oh, I finished it. I found the last 7 minutes, so I did finish the story. If I had known that was going to happen, I would have picked one of the other videos.
Well, so this is your first brush with Hawthorne then?
Yes.
What was your impression? What did you think? That was a loud pause.
I have latched onto a very specific aspect of the story, and it's got nothing to do with the main plot. But when he starts off with, the man was a man of science, blah, 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 and I was already like, does he mean science, or does he mean Frankenstein science? He meant Frankenstein science. He was an alchemist.
Yeah.
And it was awesome.
There's alchemy in this story.
That was the best part.
I've read this story before. I read this story in a college class, which is how I knew about it. But I also, before that, I unfortunately read The Scarlet Letter.
Oh, see, I never had to read that.
I hated The Scarlet Letter. viscerally. I could not understand it. And now I would, not to toot my own, well, I'm tooting my own horn from back when I was 16, which was a while ago. I have a pretty high reading level. I've always been above average reading level for my age. I literally had to get my mom to help me read the book. We read it out loud and we took turns because I could not decipher that book because he would write page-long sentences full of semicolons and brackets upon semicolons upon brackets and thoughts within thoughts within thoughts. It was so confusing.
I think there were some other classes in my school that read it, but I was never in a class that did.
Yeah, it's a very common high school book, and I don't recommend it. Hawthorne's whole thing, he basically writes Christian moral stories. Pretty much everything he writes is like that.
That definitely came through in this one, too.
Yeah, he's not subtle about it. They're very... My favorite part of the book, the bookmark, the birthmark. My favorite part of the birthmark is at the end where it explains the entire metaphorical premise of the story. And I think he's, if I'm remembering correctly, I'm trying to find the reference here, but he's like descended from a long line of like Puritans that lived in Massachusetts, which is where his religious bent came from. Obviously, the Scarlet Letter is directly about Puritans. And the birthmark, you can read it in multiple ways. He's definitely going for a God angle. Yeah, that's basically the most notable thing about him. Well, I guess we can kind of transition into the story from this. Elmer, the protagonist of the birthmark, he's not really the good guy. There is... Oh,
no. So this story was written in, the 1840s?
Yes.
We've moved past the Middle Ages kind of alchemy. Science is becoming, I think, a more established field by this point, definitely by the end of the 18th century, where we've kind of started discovering germ theory and vaccinations and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
But if we consider alchemy from the Middle Ages, it's this really strange intersection of religion, science, and philosophy. And the way we think of magic in the modern world and the way they would have back then is completely different. Because when we have fantasy stories about magic, the magic, sometimes it's like nature-based, but a lot of times the magic is kind of just like its own force that exists. Whereas for an alchemist, the magic of alchemy wouldn't have been a supernatural force that existed outside of a divine force. So all of the magic in that time would have either come from God, angels, or demons. So in their mind, that would have been a completely plausible explanation for why these really supernatural things were happening, because it was more readily accepted that divine forces were at work throughout the world.
When you think about it, what is magic but just something we can't explain? Our technology would seem like magic to somebody else.
I don't think that the Elmer, the alchemist in the story, necessarily was calling on divine powers the way a medieval alchemist would have. So you can see here the transition from magic science to more hard science, the way we would understand it today, where they're looking for things in the natural world that will give them the result that they want.
Elmer is trying to circumvent God. I don't know. Circumvent's not the exact word I want there. But he's like, I have all this knowledge in science. I've done all these experiments. I am going to be able to thwart God's will or thwart like the natural order of things and impose my own idea of perfection onto it. Elmer has a wife named Georgina, and now she is beautiful. She's Gorgiana. Everybody loves her. She's stunning. But she has a birthmark on her cheek, and the birthmark is described as being reddish in color. When she blushes, it kind of disappears. But when she's not blushing, because she's very pale, of course, because the height of beauty. So when she's not blushing, it's very visible on her perfect, flawless white skin. And it looks like a little hand, like a fairy. It's described as if a tiny fairy touched her cheek when she was born. And did I say Georgina? It's Georgiana. My bad.
Well, the narrator in the audio version that I listened to also said Georgina.
So Georgiana, my apologies, Georgiana, any Georgianas out there. Hawthorne describes the birthmark as men think it makes her more beautiful and makes her more lovely. Here, many a desperate swain would have risked life for the privilege of pressing his lips to the mysterious hand. Exclusively of her own sex, so other women called it a bloody hand. and it quite destroyed the effect of Georgiana's beauty and rendered her countenance even hideous. That, to me, sets up right there a kind of... Again, knowing that Hawthorne writes about religious things, I think he's trying to tie this to some sort of purity nonsense and physical sexual beauty or sexual attraction. And, because you can see this also even in media, will hate another girl because she's so pretty and the men all like her, but she's not even that pretty. So that was something I noticed. That's not really gothic, but it did stick out to me.
See, I was thinking here, because, like you just read, the birthmark it's not a big deal. That's not what Hawthorne is trying to say here. Such an inconsequential thing, but Elmer focuses so much on what he perceives. It's not even, I wouldn't even say it's an imperfection. It's a little mark on her face. So what? Who cares? But he's obsessed with it. And that's all he can see when he looks at her.
It's all he can see. And to the point where it does not bother her. Like, that's her birthmark. It's her face. She's lived with it her entire life. She's accepted it. She's fine with herself. Then she gets married to this joker, and they start living together, obviously, and he's like, I can't, it's hideous, I hate it, it's disgusting, it's a blemish, and he becomes obsessed with it, and the idea that it's some sort of reflection on her. He's like, I can't look at you.
Meanwhile, every other man thinks she was blessed by the Fae.
Yeah, and that's I think
not a problem.
No, and I think that's Aylmer's fatal flaw. Well, fatal for not himself, but his big flaw here, the thing that makes the story, is that he's like, this isn't perfect, I can make it perfect. And the idea that, I can make something perfect, like, that's impossible. So this whole thing out the gate is doomed to fail.
And that's where our kind of religious morality comes into it. The reason the way it ends the way it does is basically telling us that nothing worldly can be perfect, and perfection is reserved for the divine.
You can take religion out of it, and just nature knows what she's doing. Things that we perceive as being imperfect, like, that's just the way they are. Here's a line right here. It was the fatal flaw of humanity which nature, in one shape or another, stamps inefficably on all her productions, either to imply that they are temporary and finite, or that their perfection must be wrought by toil and pain.
So Aylmer has this perception of imperfection that exists only in his mind.
Yeah, but he sees it as, and here's the other line that I was thinking of earlier. He sees it as a symbol of his wife's liability to sin, sorrow, decay, and death. So, like...
Because it's a lot of projection.
It's a lot of projection. She's not... I mean, everyone's gonna die. She's not sinning. She's just his lovely wife. She loves him. She wants to be happy together, but he is so obsessed with it. He gets this look on his face every time he sees that birthmark. Soon, Georgiana, who had no problem with this before, starts to shudder, and she's like, ugh, which I do think is also a real thing that people go through, like in maybe not so healthy relationships, whether it's romantic, platonic, whatever, familial. You could be perfectly fine with something, and then if somebody just keeps degrading you about it, it's gonna start affecting the way that you see it.
It doesn't even necessarily need to be a personal relationship, because that's just how a lot of online bullying works, right?
That's true.
You post something online and people are constantly picking you apart. They're pointing out things they don't like about you. And it starts to degrade on your self-esteem, right? When people are constantly saying, well, I don't like this, you're bad at this, stop posting or whatever.
Yeah, if you're not in the right place, or you're not prepared to deal with it, or you don't have ways to cope with it, I guess I should say. Mm-hmm. And you can start being like, these people don't like the way I talk. Maybe there's something wrong with the way I talk. Or, these people don't like that I do my hair this way. Should I change that? But then you fall into the trap of, again, perfect doesn't exist. So you can change things, but nothing's going to change.
Well, Georgiana loves her husband so much. His reactions to her face start to affect her very deeply. And he has a nightmare.
Yeah, he has a nightmare, and he's talking in his sleep, so she hears him.
Yeah, and she asks him about it, and he says that he had tried cutting the birthmark off of her cheek, but the mark kept going and going and going, and it was all the way to her heart. Now, in this mind, this little tiny superficial mark on her skin is now something that's so ingrained in her as a person that he cannot separate anything about her from this tiny mark.
No, and in the dream, so he's cutting it out with a knife. He gets at last to where it has a hold of her heart, and he sees this, and he's like, I'm gonna cut it out anyways. And then so he cuts her heart out in the dream, which
it's graphic.
First of all, it's graphic. Second of all, is that even foreshadowing? That's almost exactly what happens minus the knife. Spoiler alert. But so she's like, remove the birthmark or kill me. Like, she's so pushed to the edge by this, by his obsession, by his disgust with her, that she's like, I don't want to be alive if you're going to look at me that way. But so while she's saying this to him, while she's like, kill me or find a way to remove it, she's like, you're a scientist. You've achieved great wonders. Cannot you remove this little mark, which I cover with the tips of 2 small fingers? Is this beyond your power for the sake of your own peace and to save your poor wife from madness? So again, very small mark, very tiny.
Another common Gothic theme, though, right, is the wife being driven to madness.
Yes,
by circumstances beyond her control.
But this also highlights, going back to the mad science, if you'll recall our Frankenstein discussions, how much power does man truly wield with science? Like, man thinks himself great for having all these scientific discoveries, but what does that really mean? How much power does man truly have?
Which brings us back to the science in this story, and the science in Frankenstein, which is not science as we understand it today. So Elmer takes Georgiana to his laboratory after she faints because he's again so disgusted and he's really getting to her. So
then we meet a character, Aminadab. Now, I want to make a couple notes on him because he's an important allegorical character. So first of all, the name.
I didn't look up this name, and I meant to before we started, but I have a different thought about this character.
Oh, okay, you go for it.
This character is a golem.
Yes. Later, I don't think he mentions it now, but later, Elmer describes him as a machine, was it like a human machine?
Man of clay.
Yeah, and he's
described as being short and stocky, earth-colored, like in his skin. He's a golem. He's an artificial human. Okay, Aminadab is in the Bible.
Okay,
mentioned in the lineage of Jacob's sons in Exodus. It says here, I'm just looking at Wikipedia, he's the father-in-law of the high priest Aaron, who is brother of Moses. He's just listed like in genealogy. It's also spelled a little different.
And on top of being described as clay, yeah, he's got shaggy hair, bulky frame. So he's also kind of fulfilling the laboratory assistant, the Igor sort of trope we have with mad science fiction.
With the addition of also having been created by alchemy.
Now, he is also very directly Earth. He is Earth in this story. He is basically nature working with Aylmer, and Aylmer thinks he's in control of nature, of his assistant here, but ultimately he's not.
And I would say Aminadab has kind of these little under-the-breath comments that show he expresses a lot more empathy than Aylmer does.
Aminadab says, if she were my wife, I'd never part with that birthmark. Which is also saying, like, she's a good person, she's pretty. What are you doing, dude? But he also doesn't stop Elmer. That's not his role here.
Yeah, it says very specifically that he's the ideal assistant because he carries out to the letter that everything Elmer asks him to do. If we're considering he's an artificial human, he may be compelled to, even if he doesn't necessarily want to. That may be part of the conditions of his existence.
Again, being nature, right? Like, we can, to a certain extent, observe nature around us and kind of predict things, or maybe not command it necessarily, but if I mix water and dirt, I get mud, like certain things. But then nature is also going to, sometimes you can mix water and dirt and you get clay instead because you don't have what you think you have. You don't understand it.
Right.
That metaphor was a little strained, but you know what I mean.
Yeah, so Elmer's doing all these experiments.
And so he made up a room for his wife, for Georgiana. So he made up a nice little room for her to hang out in. He does not want her hanging over him when he's doing the experiments. He keeps them from her. Aylmer also shows her and now here we're kind of getting into the alchemy in this part of the story, because he shows her some things that he's created, pretty things like illusions. He shows her also a plant that springs up out of the dirt, and then as soon as it blooms, it dies.
Another literal metaphor.
I don't hate this story the way I hated The Scarlet Letter. It's a fine enough story. It's not too long either. I do recommend reading it if you have the time. But Hawthorne in general, it just is annoying to me.
You know, he does use a lot of words.
Like this is much easier to read. I can read this. In case you didn't like the flower metaphor, here's another one. He makes a portrait of Georgiana. He describes it through a quote-unquote scientific process of his own invention, which is to be affected by rays of light striking upon a polished plate of metal. It's a photo. This was published in 1843. First camera.
Actually, when did photography get developed?
Well, using plates was, I believe, mid 1800s. I'm just checking the dates on that here.
Well, I know we had it by the 1860s because we had photography during the Civil War.
Yes.
So what is our earliest?
The earliest surviving photograph is from 1826. The first permanent photograph of a camera image using a sliding wooden box camera. Blah blah blah. Yeah. So and then it develops from there. So obviously, he's seen camera, I'm sure, or at least heard of them in 1846 or 1843.
So he did not come up with this concept by himself.
No, but so either this story is set before that, or Aylmer thinks that he's come up with a different, better way to do it.
I'm going to go with probably the latter.
Yeah, knowing Aylmer and what we know of him, he probably is like, oh, you have that thing? Well, I'm going to do it better. But then, so he takes this portrait of Georgiana, but when he sees the result, the portrait is blurred except for the birthmark. The only clear part of the image is the birthmark, and so then he throws it in acid.
Was it just his brain seeing what he wants to see?
Yeah, so, if you don't like the flower metaphor, this one. It's just literally within 2 paragraphs. One paragraph is the flower. The next paragraph is this portrait. And the fact that he throws it into acid, also, again, foreshadowing. So then he's still experimenting, and
here's the thing that got me, right?
Yeah.
When they're having the discussion about him removing the birthmark, and she says, oh, you're such a great man of science. You maybe have some ideas, and he jumps right in with, of course, I've already thought about this.
Yeah.
But then he didn't actually have anything prepared.
Oh, and this is also the part of the book where he talks about the alchemy. He gave a history of the long dynasty of the alchemists, who spent so many ages in quest of the universal solvent by which the golden principle might be elicited from all things vile and base. Aylmer appeared to believe that, by the plainest scientific logic, it was altogether within the limits of possibility to discover this long-sought medium. But, he added, a philosopher who should go deep enough to acquire the power would attain too lofty a wisdom to stoop to the exercise of it. I think he's saying that because he can't do it. So he's like, he's implying, even if I knew how to do it, I wouldn't.
Right.
So you can never prove that he doesn't know how to do it. And then Georgiana, he goes on this rant, and Georgiana says, it is terrible to possess such power. And then he says, I would not wrong either you or myself by working such inharmonious effects upon our lives. But I would have you consider how trifling, in comparison, is the skill requisite to remove this little hand. So he's just completely missing the point. He said it right there. I would not wrong you or myself by working such inharmonious effects upon our lives. You can just see that he does not view the birthmark and his wife in the way that he should. And at one point, Georgiana decides that he must be experimenting on her without her knowledge because she feels weird. So he's either giving her something in her food or she's breathing something in.
Yeah, she describes the air as having weird floral kind of scent. You can probably safely assume that she's being drugged somehow.
Yeah, they never give any details about that, but she does feel that way. So she goes over his library. Aylmer has this huge scientific library. He's got a bunch of journals along with books of poetry, philosophy, stuff like that. And so she reads about his experiments and all the things he's done. So as she's reading about his experiments, she finds out, so there's a large folio from her husband's own hand in which he had recorded every experiment of his scientific career, its original aim, the methods adopted for development, and the final success or failure. How many successes and versus failures do we think this man has had?
I'm going to probably say more failures, since he seems to be all talk.
Yeah, and you know what? You are correct. He handled physical details as if there were nothing beyond them, yet spiritualized them all, and redeemed himself from materialism by his strong and eager aspiration towards the infinite. So she is reading all this, and she respects him and she loves him more than ever.
There's also direct references to very famous alchemists in this portion.
Oh yeah, that's in the paragraph before this. Well, let me just finish this thought and then we can come back to the alchemy. So basically, she's reading that he has successes, but he's failing at what he sets out to do, is essentially what she's saying. It was a sad confession and continual exemplification of the shortcomings of the composite man, the spirit burdened with clay and working in matter, and of the despair that assails the higher nature at finding itself so miserably thwarted by the earthly part. But anyway, did you want to talk about the alchemists? It just kind of lists them.
Yeah, it lists them because it lists them as sources of reference for Elmer.
Yeah, it describes some of the works he had in the library were Albertus Magnus, Cornelius Agrippa.
Probably the most famous alchemist to ever exist.
Yeah. Oh, and the famous friar who created the prophetic brazen head.
It's just really interesting because by this point, definitely by the 1840s, science as a field has abandoned alchemy.
Hawthorne including it here, Elmer being an alchemist in this day and age, is probably him commenting on that.
Even in Frankenstein, which we're going to keep referencing here, the whole first part of the novel, which was first published in 1818, and
Yes.
the whole first the first couple of chapters when Victor is at university and he's studying and keeps trying to study all these alchemical texts, and his professors are telling him, what are you doing? We don't subscribe to this anymore. This is outdated. This is not considered science. And they're trying to get him to stop, but he doesn't, which is eventually what leads to him creating the artificial human.
Well, what we were talking about earlier with, magic versus science versus religion, and how those things have become much more separate from each other as society has advanced. So he's missing the divine, but he's got the magic and the science. Aylmer's problem is that he is not including God, which is Hawthorne's whole point. If you're going to look at it from a non-Christian angle, or like I'm not even going to say non-religious, because as a pagan person, this is kind of the way I look at things. But because you can look at nature kind of as the divine. Like, as someone who doesn't believe in a Christian God or a Christian whatever, I don't subscribe to a Christian dogma. So for me, we come from the earth, which kind of makes nature divine. But I do think reading this with that kind of mindset I think it specifically adds to the character of Aminadab, because he is so obviously the stand-in, an allegory for nature, or a golem. He's very earthy.
Right, and Elmer is trying to subjugate nature for his own purposes.
Yeah, but I also think it kind of almost, just having that mindset almost lends him this cheeky kind of I don't even know what I'm trying to say. But it's almost like he knows that Aylmer's going to fail from the get-go, but he lets him do it. But so we're coming kind of to the end of the story here. Georgiana decides to go into the lab because she's feeling this symptom that she's like, oh, I should tell him about it. Because they just say it's a sensation in the fatal birthmark. It's not pain, but she's feeling something. So she goes in there for the first time into the laboratory. And so we get a description of it for the first time. There's a furnace. There's a lot of soot. It's very hot. There's distilling apparatus, tubes, cylinders, glass, the works.
Well, it's kind of hellish.
It reminded me, I was kind of picturing in Metropolis when the machines are kind of turning into a mouth.
Ah.
So Elmer is in there. He's pale and anxious. He's hovering over whatever he's working on with the furnace. He's not happy.
No.
He's not experiencing any sort of joy.
He's also going through all this when home remedies for removing things like freckles and birthmarks, effective or not, already existed.
Oh yeah, and that comes up. He has something to get rid of freckles, and he's like, oh no, we got to go deeper.
Yeah, because he's convinced that it's a fundamental flaw with her entire personality.
I will bring you back, dear listener, to the dream that Elmer had previously that brought all this on, where he was trying to cut the birthmark out, and it went so deep that it went to her heart, and he was like, I'll cut that out too. And this is another thing, right? Like, if we go again with nature as the divine, Aylmer has this dream, this prophetic dream, which you could argue is either given to him by God or nature, whoever. And he ignores it. He's like, that won't happen. I won't kill my wife. But he got a warning. The red flag was there, and he ignored it.
He sure did.
Yeah, and so this is now where we hear carefully now. So Aylmer is talking. Carefully now, Aminadab. Carefully, thou human machine. Carefully, thou man of clay. But he more to himself than to his assistant. Now, if there be a thought too much or too little, it is all over. He's watching over Aminadab do this. And then Aminadab is like, look, master, look. And then so they notice Georgiana. He gets really upset about this. And he's like, why don't you trust me? And also, he's like, why would you have that blight of that fatal birthmark watch over my labors?
Taking too dang long.
He's taking too long, and Georgiana came out there, but then he's like, you're going to make it bad. So again, he's kind of shucking responsibility there a little bit.
This is also giving whatever he's doing this spiritual quality, where he's ascribing just the presence of things being in the room, being able to change the nature of whatever he's creating.
Yeah, it's very superstitious. Georgiana doesn't leave the one time she has a spine.
She should have left, and then she should have just kept going.
She should have pushed him into the furnace. That's how my version would end.
I don't think that would have been in her nature, because she's such a good, kind, virtuous person.
That's true. No, you know what? I think she should have eloped with Aminadab. He'd appreciate her.
Yeah, he would have.
And she's like, no, you're mistrusting me because you're not telling me what you're anxious about. And tell me what the risk is. And he's like, no, I won't do it. And he's being described here as, he seizes her arm with a grip that left the print of his fingers upon it. So he's gripping her very hard, and he's crying impetuously. And he's, no, Georgiana, said Aylmer impatiently. This must not be. So he's in a tizzy. Georgiana is calm. She's calm, cool, and collected. I shall quaff whatever drought you bring me, but it will be on the same principle that would induce me to take a dose of poison if offered by your hand. It basically is poison. He doesn't intend it to be, but that's what it ends up. And this moves Aylmer. So then Aylmer says, my noble wife, I knew not the height and depth of your nature until now. Nothing shall be concealed. Know, then, that this crimson hand, superficial as it seems, has clutched its grasp into your being with a strength of which I had no previous conception. I have already administered agents powerful enough to do aught except to change your entire physical system. Only one thing remains to be tried. If that fail us, we are ruined. So we do get confirmation. He was, in fact, experimenting on her previously. Agents powerful enough to change your entire physical system.
All this for a little mark on her skin.
Yeah, also, I knew not the height and depth of your nature until now. BS, dude. That's total BS. She's a saint. She's only doing this because you're such a jerk. So she's like, either make it so you're not disgusted when you look at me or kill me. So then she's like, well, why didn't you tell me this? And he says it's dangerous. And Georgiana says, danger? There is but one danger, that this horrible stigma shall be left upon my cheek. So now this is a complete reversal of the way she felt at the beginning of the story. Because at the beginning of the story, he's like, did you ever think about having it removed? And she says, no, indeed. And she's smiling. She's smiling about this. To tell you the truth, it has been so often called a charm that I was simple enough to imagine it might be so. So complete reversal of the way she felt. And so then he's like, okay, well, go back to your room. I got to finish this up.
Still taking way too long.
Yeah, and so she goes, Georgiana's in there thinking. She's thinking about the character of her husband. Her heart exulted while it trembled at his honorable love, so pure and lofty that it would accept nothing less than perfection, nor miserably make itself contented with an earthlier nature than he had dreamed of. The saddest sentence of this whole story, I think.
He's just doing way too much.
He's basically gaslit her into thinking that she's bad for having this bad thing on her, when in fact, it is not a bad thing to have a birthmark, and she is not a bad person. And she's been manipulated into this. And to view him positively for it. She's like, oh, he's doing this to help me. He's so honorable, so pure and lofty. That is not what this is. Oh, and so then it says here, with her whole spirit she prayed that for a single moment she might satisfy his highest and deepest conception, longer than one moment she well knew it could not be, for his spirit was ever on the march, ever ascending, and each instant required something that was beyond the scope of the instant before. She's acknowledging that even if it's successful, it's not going to be enough for him. It'll be successful, and he'll be like, okay, I'm going to go back. Because he's basically dropped all of the other stuff he was working on to marry her, and then now to do all these experiments to get rid of the birthmark. So they're going to get rid of the birthmark, and then what? He's just going to basically go back to being a jerk.
Yeah, because it's not about the birthmark.
No, he's just trying to make a point. He's trying to prove something. He's trying to prove that he's better than God or nature or whatever you want to say, that he knows better. So he comes in bearing a crystal goblet, not an egg, and it's described as bright enough to be the draught of immortality.
Yeah, well, we're now alluding still to alchemy things with the elixir of life, and it's kind of incredible it didn't just delve into him making a philosopher's stone to solve a non-existent problem.
Yeah, and Elmer says, of the potion, unless all my science have deceived me, it cannot fail. Well, guess what?
He wasn't doing science.
She's like, you could tell we're getting to the end of this because I'm losing my ability to say words. I might wish to put off this birthmark of mortality by relinquishing mortality itself. Ellipsis, ... Life is but a sad possession to those who have attained precisely the degree of moral advancement at which I stand. Were I weaker and blinder, it might be happiness. Were I stronger, it might be endured hopefully. But, being what I find myself, methinks I am of all mortals the most fit to die.
This is so dramatic.
It's so dramatic. And this is why I think this is such a good candidate for a gothic podcastle. Because yes, you do have the morality and the ethics and the kind of being a fable, the way Hawthorne likes to do. But it's way more dramatic than the other ones. I also, in this class that I read this for, we also read Young Goodman Brown. Didn't like that one. That one was a little too gaudy. Goddy, not Gaudy.
Okay, yeah.
This one is gaudy. Gaudy. This one has got drama. It's got really heightened good versus evil. It's got a damsel in distress, a perfect maiden. We've got mad science. We've got alchemy.
Anyhow, Georgiana drinks this. It's a magic potion.
It's a magic potion. He's still convinced it cannot fail, but lo and behold. So he proves this to her he pours some onto a diseased flower that's got spots on it. And then it sucks up the potion, and then all the blotches go away. And she's like, just give me the goblet.
Sure, you can, put an antifungal spray on a plant, but that doesn't mean you should drink it.
No, and this goes back to our conversation, but we were talking earlier about medications, and, even, a medication can affect somebody with the same condition in two very different ways, because it depends on each person is different. So she takes it, she drinks it, and she says, "This is great. It is like water from a heavenly fountain, for it contains I know not what of unobtrusive fragrance and deliciousness. It allays a feverish thirst that had parched me for many days."
Yeah, because he kept her in this room.
Yeah, and was either drugging her or using some sort of smoke vapor to alter her body somehow. So then she falls asleep, just asleep on her feet. He brings her to bed, and he sits by her, and he's there. He's a scientist. He's taking notes. He is noting every single little symptom, any twitch that she makes, any difference in her color, any sign at all.
Well, he wasn't wrong about one thing. The birthmark does go away.
Yes.
It worked in that respect.
Yes, it did. So she's still sleeping while all this is happening. It starts to fade. She remains not less pale than ever, but the birthmark, with every breath that came and went, lost somewhat of its former distinctness. Its presence had been awful, its departure more awful still. Watch the stain of the rainbow fading out of the sky, and you will know how that mysterious symbol passed away. I just like that line, I'll be honest. But he kisses the birthmark before it fades away completely. So this, again, going back to the beginning of the story, there's mention of how many dapper young gentlemen before Georgiana and Aylmer married would have died. They would have given their life to kiss that birthmark. Now he kisses it before it fades away, and his spirit recoiled in the very act. So anyway, he hasn't learned his lesson. And he's like, "Oh my god, it was a success. The lightest flush of blood across her cheek would overcome it, but she is so pale." And so he opens the curtains, He's like, oh, maybe sunlight will help. Aminadab is laughing in delight. His expression, he's delighted. He's happy. He's laughing. And again, Aylmer calls him a clod, an earthly mass. Really befitting the mad scientist role here. He's laughing in a sort of frenzy. He's like, you did a good job. Thank you for serving me. Matter and spirit, earth and heaven, have both done their part in this. Laugh, thing of the senses. You have earned the right to laugh. He's saying this to Aylmer. Aylmer thinks he's won. He's triumphed over matter and spirit, earth and heaven. He's been in command of them and had them do his bidding, along with Aminadab. So then Georgiana wakes up, and she looks in the mirror. She can't see the birthmark, and she's happy. She smiles. And then she's like, ah, poor Aylmer. And he said, wait, what no? Richest, happiest, most favored, my peerless bride, it is successful. You are perfect.
Yeah,
and then
here's the fatal flaw.
Here's the fatal flaw. My poor Aylmer, she repeated, with a more than human tenderness. You have aimed loftily. You have done nobly. Do not repent that was so high and pure a feeling. You have rejected the best the earth could offer. Aylmer, dearest Aylmer, I am dying. Literally, you have rejected the best the earth could offer. She was already great.
Yep, non-existent problems.
You ruined it, dude. You killed her. So the fatal hand, the birthmark, the little fairy hand, as in Aylmer's dream, was linked with her. You cannot expunge all imperfection out of a person or anything. Nothing in life is perfect.
No, and because he removed what's really described as her only flaw, because she's gorgeous, she's a kind, loving person.
Token of human imperfection.
Right, so now because she is perfect,
she's no longer human.
She's not, yeah, so this is going back to what I said with the perfection belonging to the divine. It's like now that she's perfect, so she just immediately dies so she can go to heaven.
Yeah, and you kind of get that too when it's described when she's talking to him with a more than human tenderness. So she's ascended.
Basically, yeah. And her soul just departs and goes on its way.
So then Aminadab is chuckling again. And okay, I'm going to read this part out in full because if you weren't paying attention during the story, if you weren't paying attention to us ramble, which if you got this far, how'd you get this far? But I'm going to read this whole thing because this will explain the entire story to you if you missed it. Thus ever does the gross fatality of earth exult in its invariable triumph over the immortal essence which, in this dim sphere of half-development, demands the completeness of a higher state. Yet, had Aylmer reached a profounder wisdom, he need not thus have flung away the happiness which would have woven his mortal life of the self-same texture with the celestial. The momentary circumstance was too strong for him. He failed to look beyond the shadowy scope of time, and, living once for all in eternity, to find the perfect future in the present.
Making problems out of nothing, not being happy with things that were already great, because, again, we had no problems, and he made one up.
Yeah, exactly. Aylmer does not reach any, like, in a lot of Russian literature, which this kind of reminds me of, a lot of Russian short stories, I should say, because I haven't read any novels. I've read short stories. A lot of the times in Russian literature, the main character will learn about their fatal flaw. They'll have the come to Jesus moment, the epiphany. They'll realize the errors of their ways, whatever, and then they die. Kind of like what you were saying earlier, with Georgiana. She reaches perfection and then she dies because perfection is for the divine. Aylmer never repents or learns anything. Georgiana dies. So this story is it's a very story, if that, like, this story is for the reader.
Right. The lesson is for our benefit.
Right. The story has a very clear purpose. And does that make sense what I'm trying to say? Yeah. It's almost like these characters don't really exist outside of being characters. Whereas I would argue that when we read something that I really enjoy, like even Knights of the Circus, which had its ups and downs, that's a bad example because I feel like those characters are really charactery too.
Yes, they are.
Let's go with Frankenstein because we've been talking about that. The story of Frankenstein and the characters in Frankenstein, I mean, obviously that story does say something. There are metaphors and parallels, allegories, etc. But it's a very human story. And those characters, I could see them existing both before and after the book, if that makes sense. Like, they have a life of their own.
Well,
the characters in this story don't have that kind of life. Like, they're just...
Yeah,
which is the point of the story. That's why Hawthorne wrote. It's interesting because I don't think we read a lot of stuff that is so blatantly
like a
spells.
fable, right?
Yeah, it is. It's very much like a fable, because the whole thing about fables, I had actually looked this up before we started. The definition of a fable is they often feature animals, but they don't have to. The kind of main feature is that forces of nature or inanimate objects, plants, animals, etc., they're anthropomorphized. So that's how the moral, that's how they get the moral across. Or a parable is also kind of similar to that, except they don't usually employ animals and plants. But anyways, it's different than what we usually read. Gothic has that good versus evil, right and wrong. People, good is rewarded, and people, typically the bad guy gets their comeuppance. Or, if it's a tragedy, everybody dies. This is not that. Aylmer does not get any comeuppance. I mean, his wife dies, but I doubt, knowing what we know about Aylmer, it probably doesn't bother him. He'll just go get another one. So it's not a very satisfying good versus evil ending. I guess what I'm trying to say is that we as the reader get the point of the story, but Aylmer doesn't. And that bothers me.
Oh.
I want him to be punished. The fact that he doesn't get punished for the evil, it just kind of bothers me.
Well,
as a fan of the Gothic, that's one of the best parts about it.
I mean, the story just ends there, so there's, I guess, nothing stopping anyone from writing a continuation or inserting their own epilogue.
Yeah, that's true. Well, he was American. I was about to say maybe my fan canon head theory fan theory is gonna be that Dracula comes and sucks him dry.
Okay.
But that's a little bit of a cost here.
Yeah.
I was thinking a lot about Dracula because we're always thinking about Dracula. But I saw a copy in the thrift today. I didn't get it, but I did see it.
In conclusion, after having listened or discussed this whole story, and I know sometimes we meander a little bit, or I don't want to say that we get off topic, but I kind of want to bring things all back into a nice, neat little summary.
Our path it's like a river. It has tributaries, but we always make it back to the main branch of the water.
Yeah, so now let's bring everything back to the main river. You mentioned before his Puritan background.
Yes.
And as you were reading, I was just kind of reading a little bit more about him, and he was from a Puritan family, but he was not himself a Puritan.
No, he was not. In fact, he greatly disliked Puritans, including and especially his ancestors.
So what I was thinking now, and I think this is a good thing about having these discussions too, because you read the story, and I think when you're talking about it, especially with someone else, it really helps you bring all the ideas into focus, because there's a lot packed into this.
And it also helps having another perspective, because people will see things that you don't.
Exactly. I was having this thought as we were doing this, and I looked up deeper details about his relationship with Puritanism, and I thought this is kind of like a satire of Puritan values, because the Puritans were known for being really strict.
No glitz and glamour, and
so they're known for this really austere kind of lifestyle. And the reason for that was because they were trying to really stamp out anything sinful.
Yes.
And as we did say before, the birthmark is more than just a mark. It is a metaphor just for sin, just in general.
Yeah, and it is interesting from that perspective. I mean, I feel like we covered this, so not to go too far into the weeds, but the scientist in this story is kind of the quote-unquote Puritan Christian ideal of trying to have this perfect human being without sin, right?
But it's not possible. Just by being human, you're going to make mistakes, and you're going to do things that are wrong. It's just part of the human experience. If you are continually, this is a different thing from just, being a good person and trying to do the best you can, but having this obsession with not doing anything that doesn't follow this extremely rigid and strict lifestyle, it's almost to the detriment of yourself, because you will be depriving yourself of any kind of experience.
Oh yeah, and even it's you're so wrapped up with what'll happen after you die that you just don't do anything. You're not appreciating the beauty that the God you believe in created, right?
Right.
It's why did God make you? Just to suffer and try not to go to hell?
Right. It's you're so focused on the afterlife that you don't live.
Yeah.
So by trying to remove this birthmark from his wife, Elmer is perpetuating, and it's hyperbolic. We're not supposed to look at this and think, oh yeah, that's a good thing that he's doing, because it's so, like we said before, it's dramatic, it's blown out of proportion.
Yeah, they're all just, they're not really people, they're characters, they're symbolism. They are symbols and allegories.
And I think I had an additional thought about him being an alchemist. I think by making him an alchemist, Hawthorne is showing us that his motivation is not actually godly.
It's farcical.
It's very misguided. I was also thinking too, I know we said he probably was claiming to invent the picture, but Hawthorne never really gives us an exact setting for this. Thinking about it now, it probably was meant to take place during the medieval time period.
Oh yeah.
You think?
There's literally nothing.
We just get we just had those kind of couple little things like the alchemy, and then he took a portrait and that's a new invention.
I guess if I'm not given a time period or enough descriptors, I just assume the story I'm reading is set during the author's lifetime. Because right, if you're writing for an audience, you're either, back then it would either be historical fiction or present day. You could also say you don't really need the setting. I mean, the time period would help give it context, but it doesn't really change the ending.
I was thinking too, the fact that men wanted to, kiss the birthmark and they thought it was kind of a point of attraction may have also been reinforcing this idea of sin and temptation.
That's true. The men are tempted.
But ultimately, and that's why it's so ingrained in Georgiana's being to her heart, because it is this metaphor for sin and just the things that make us human versus being perfect divine beings.
Hawthorne really did believe this. He did have a personal relationship with God. He didn't really subscribe to any particular sect but he was Christian. He believed in God and all that stuff. He believed that sin and evil are just an inherent part of humanity. That was literally part of his beliefs. So that makes a lot of sense, the way he uses Georgiana to illustrate that. She's perfect to the extent that she can be.
Exactly. And I have to say, if her only so-called blemish is this mark on her face, that woman never did anything wrong in her life.
No, and had incredible skincare routine.
Yeah.
I got wrinkles and blemishes.
Oh no. But yeah, and that's why when all the birthmark is removed and she's completely sinless, she just gets the speed run to heaven. And Elmer's left with nothing because he tried to bend nature in ways that it's not meant to be.
Yeah, in this, keeping with the religious in this kind of interpretation, I kind of like to think that Georgiana's flaw, her heart-deep sin or whatever, just got passed on to him, so that when it's his time to die, he's gonna get to that gate, and they're gonna be like, nah, take the stairs, go down.
No, see, going down is the easy way. It's going up that's hard.
Yeah, that's true.
As you get on the elevator, the hellavator.
I'm on a elevator.
And it's the stairway to heaven.
Yeah.
The stairway to heaven and the highway to hell. It's always more difficult to go up.
Speaking of going down to hell, physically traveling, how you get there, I just think of that one little Nas X video where he just takes the stripper pole all the way down.
See, the easy way.
Yeah.
Should we wrap it up then? I think we've said just about everything we can about this without now just going into circles and repeating ourselves. So we're flowing out to sea now.
All the tributaries have reconvened, rejoined with the river. We are once again on a clear, unobstructed path. Okay, well, that's it from us and dear old Nathaniel Hawthorne.
Do you think he'll come back?
Nathaniel Hawthorne?
Yeah. You think he'll be featured on this podcast again? He's not your favorite, but who knows what the future will hold.
Yeah, you never know. Maybe something will fit with the theme or something.
All right, well, that's it for me.
Yep, that's all I got. We'll see you next time, audience, where we'll read something else. Bye!
Bye!